प्रोफेसर कल्याण कुमार बागची जी जुड़ गए?
जी सर, जुड़ चुके हैं।
अच्छा, स्टार्ट कीजिए।
जी सर, welcome you all and the special lecture program organized by Indian Council of Philosophical Research Academic Center, and we welcome you in this special online program on behalf of ICPR. In this program, which is organized, is going to be series in the Swadhinta Ka Amrit Mahotsav. Under this series, today's program we are organizing the subject of Swaraj in ideas. In this program, our Honorable Chairman, Professor R.C. Sinha, we welcome you, sir, in this program. We welcome our Member Secretary, Indian Council of Philosophical Research, Professor Sachidanand Mishra, sir. We welcome you. In this program, we have our special guest, Honorable Chairman, Professor Shashi Prabha Kumar, Madam, Indian Institute of IIS Shimla. We welcome you, Madam, in this program. And in this program, we have our Chief Speaker, Professor Kalyan Kumar Bagchi, former Head Department of Philosophy, Shanti Niketan. We welcome you, sir, in this program. Dr. Jaishankar Singh, Professor J.M. Dave, sir, Professor Ambika Datt Sharma, sir, and all the participants who have joined on this online platform in this program. We welcome you, the daughter of Professor Kalyan Kumar Bagchi, Bellari Bagchi also, and Professor Kalyan Kumar Bagchi joined with the idea of his daughter, Bellari Bagchi. We welcome you all in this program of special Swaraj in Ideas. Before we start this program, we would like to invite our Honorable Member Secretary, Professor Sachidanand Mishra, sir, to welcome and his views according to on this program topic. Professor Sachidanand Mishra, sir.
नमस्कार समादरणीय अध्यक्ष महोदय, आज की विशिष्ट अतिथि प्रोफेसर शशि प्रभा कुमार जी, जो भारतीय प्रगत अध्ययन संस्थान शिमला की अध्यक्षा हैं, आज के विशिष्ट वक्ता प्रोफेसर कल्याण कुमार बागची जी, और आज के इस कार्यक्रम में श्रोता के रूप में उपस्थित प्रोफेसर अंबिका दत्त शर्मा, प्रोफेसर जे.एम. दवे, प्रोफेसर अरविंद विक्रम सिंह और देश के अलग अलग प्रांतों से जुड़े हुए अनेक विद्वज्जन। आज का प्रोफेसर कृष्णैया जी भी हमारे साथ जुड़े हुए हैं। प्रोफेसर पनीर सिल्वम जी को भी हम स्वागत करते हैं। प्रोफेसर राजकुमारी सिन्हा जी भी हमारे साथ जुड़ी हुई हैं, आपका भी हम हार्दिक अभिनंदन और हार्दिक स्वागत कर रहे हैं। और बहुत सारे विद्वज्जन अलग अलग जगहों से, अलग अलग कोनों से हमारे इस कार्यक्रम के साथ जुड़े हुए हैं। हम सभी विद्वानों का आज के इस कार्यक्रम में स्वागत करते हैं। यह बहुत हर्ष का विषय है कि प्रोफेसर कल्याण कुमार बागची जी जैसे विद्वान आज के कार्यक्रम में व्याख्यान देने के लिए हमारे बीच उपस्थित हैं। हमारे अनुरोध को स्वीकार कर उन्होंने व्याख्यान देने को यहाँ पर सहमति दी, इसके लिए हम आपके आभारी हैं। आजादी के अमृत महोत्सव के अंतर्गत जो बहुत सारे कार्यक्रम आयोजित किए जा रहे हैं, उसके अंतर्गत एक कार्यक्रम यह भी है। आज का यह जो विशिष्ट व्याख्यान, वह भी आजादी के अमृत महोत्सव के अंतर्गत आयोजित किया जा रहा है। स्वराज इन आइडियाज। स्वराज जो है हमारे विचारों में किस प्रकार से अभिव्यक्त होता है, क्योंकि हम केवल भौतिक रूप से गुलाम हों और हम बौद्धिक रूप से गुलाम न हों, तो यह एक बहुत बड़ी बात होती है। हमारे साथ, हमारी गुलामी के साथ एक दूसरी भी समस्या जो जुड़ी रही, वह यह कि हमारी जो भौतिक गुलामी थी वह तो दूर हो गई, भौतिक परतंत्रता तो समाप्त हो गई, परंतु बौद्धिक गुलामी अभी तक कायम है। बहुत सारे विषयों में, बहुत सारी चीजों में हम अभी उसी प्रकार से सोचते हैं, उसी प्रकार से विचार करते हैं जिस प्रकार से पश्चिमी विद्वान विचार करते हैं। या कहना चाहिए कि हम भारतीय विद्वानों के द्वारा कोई मतांतर अगर उपस्थापित किया जाता है तो उसको उस तरह से संज्ञान में नहीं लेते तब तक जब तक कि पश्चिमी विद्वानों के द्वारा उसकी सहमति नहीं प्राप्त होती है। तो यह एक तरह से बौद्धिक गुलामी का ही परिप्रेक्ष्य है, उसकी ही पहचान है। और जब हम स्वराज इन आइडियाज की बात करते हैं तो उसके साथ यह बात जुड़ी होती है कि हम अपने आप को उन बंधनों से भी मुक्त करें जो हमारे वैचारिक चिंतन पर, हमारे वैचारिक सीमाओं पर लगे हुए हैं, उनको हमको दूर करने की अपेक्षा है। तो इसलिए आज का जो यह व्याख्यान हमारे बीच दिया जाने वाला है प्रोफेसर कल्याण कुमार बागची के द्वारा, वह बहुत महत्वपूर्ण है, क्योंकि बौद्धिक गुलामी सबसे बड़ी गुलामी है। जैसे कि पश्चिमी दर्शन के इतिहास को समझते हुए, देखते हुए हम इस बात को समझ सकते हैं, लगभग 1000 वर्षों का काल, जिस काल को हम डार्क एज के रूप में जानते हैं, अंधकार युग के रूप में जानते हैं, वह काल वही काल था जिसमें कि बौद्धिक गुलामी थी, बौद्धिक चिंतन को मुक्ति नहीं प्राप्त हुई थी। तो अगर उस प्रकार से बौद्धिक चिंतन को मुक्ति ना प्राप्त हो, वह उसी प्रकार से जुड़ता रहे, उसी प्रकार से चलता रहे जो पहले चल रहा था, या पहले से भी गलत स्थिति में चलता रहे, तो वह एक विचित्र किस्म की गुलामी है। और उस गुलामी से मुक्ति सबसे बड़ी अनिवार्यता है। और किसी भी देश की वास्तविक स्वतंत्रता तभी हो सकती है जब वह न केवल भौतिक रूप से स्वतंत्र हो, बल्कि वैचारिक रूप से भी स्वतंत्र हो। और वैचारिक स्वतंत्रता तभी आ सकती है जब हम मुक्त चिंतन करें, बुद्धि को सोचने के लिए पूरा अवसर प्रदान करें। तो यह आज का जो व्याख्यान दिया जाने वाला है स्वराज इन आइडियाज के ऊपर, उस व्याख्यान के बारे में मैं बहुत ज्यादा चर्चा नहीं करते हुए आप सभी जो विशिष्ट वक्तागण हैं, जो विशिष्ट श्रोतागण हैं, आज के जो अध्यक्ष हैं, आज की जो विशिष्ट अतिथि हैं, आप सभी का हृदय से स्वागत करते हुए मैं अपनी वाणी को यहीं पर विराम देता हूं। निश्चित ही आज के व्याख्यान के माध्यम से हमारे बुद्धि के, हमारे चिंतन के कुछ नए आयाम उद्घाटित होंगे। धन्यवाद।
थैंक यू सर, धन्यवाद। Today's topic, Swaraj in Ideas. Professor Kalyan Kumar Bagchi, who is going to deliver his speech with us on the Swaraj in Ideas, and it is specially based on in October 1931, the philosopher K.C. Bhattacharya has delivered a lecture, and which we called Swaraj in Ideas. And as Professor Sachidanand Mishra sir elaborate the subject and dimensions of the casteism and many other boundaries of the mind also. And accordingly, Professor Bagchi, who is going to deliver his lecture with involve all these dimensions which are explained in the Swaraj in Ideas and many other ideas by Professor Kalyan Kumar Bagchi himself is explained. So we would like to be not wasting our time. We would like to invite, everybody wants to listen Professor Kalyan Kumar Bagchi. So we welcome you, sir, and we invite you for your daily lecture. Professor Kalyan Kumar Bagchi, sir.
Thank you. Am I audible?
Yes, sir. Most welcome, sir.
Yes,
Most
sir.
welcome.
Thank you. Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning and a good day for all of us.
Namaste. Dada, namaste.
Namaste.
Namaste. Namaste. Namaste. I wish all of you, each one of you, best of health and happiness. Sarve bhavantu sukhinah, sarve santu niramayah, sarve bhadrani pashyantu, ma kaschit dukkha bhavo bhavet. Well, there is some anecdote, there are two anecdotes relating to my paper on Professor K.C. Bhattacharya's Swaraj in Ideas. Swaraj in Ideas was and the dialectic of Indian rationality. The full title, the entire title of the paper is Professor K.C. Bhattacharya's Swaraj in Ideas. the dialectic of Indian rationality. Swarajin ideas was originally Professor K.C. Bhattacharya's address to the students of the college of which he was principal. It was written sometime in the 30s of the last century. Later on, in 1954, it was published by the Vishwabharati Quarterly Shanti Niketan under the editorship of, well, I don't remember the name of the editor, but anyway. In 1982, there is a special issue of the Indian Philosophical Quarterly. I made it available, I made the paper available to them, but since I was very busy with the current Congress in Germany, I could not write any paper on Swarajin ideas for that volume. Anyway, for what it is worth, I now present my paper. Professor R.P. Singh, Chairman, ICPR, Professor Shuchi Prabha Kumar, Chairperson, IIAS, Dr. Shuchinanda Mishra, Member Secretary of the ICPR, Dr. Pooja Bass, Director, ICPR Lucknow Center, Dr. Joy Shankar Sila, Senior Consultant, ICPR Academic Center, Lucknow. And I'm glad to see Paneer Silvam is here. And I'm also glad to see Dilip Kumar Mohanto, one of my favorite students, present here. Dilip, bhalo acho? And I welcome Dr. Dave, Krishnaya, Pooja Bass, Prabhas Kumar, and all others who are present here. Let me now turn to the paper for what it is worth. Before that, there are some two anecdotes which I would like to mention. That was in 2013. I was in Shanti Niketan. I just got a phone call from my late lamented friend, Dr. Praveen Huil. He congratulated me since I had become emeritus professor of Vishwabharati. But at the same time, he was trying to bind me with one thing. He said, Professor Bakshi, now you have to write an article on Swarajin ideas. Well, at about the same time, my complete book on Professor K.C. Bhattacharya's entire philosophy was published by the Department of Philosophy, Calcutta University, during the centenary of the Department of Philosophy. And it was Professor J.N. Mahanti who released the book. For some time, I had been really toying with the idea of writing a paper on Swarajin ideas, but I couldn't venture to. Well, I was in two minds because you see, it appeared to me from time to time that it had some connections with Professor K.C. Bhattacharya's seminal book on the subject of freedom. But at the same time, I felt that I was not equal to the task of relating Swarajin ideas to his book on the subject of freedom. But anyway, friends all around India, they had been pestering me with the request, but then the die was cast for me by my friend, Dr. R.C. Sinha, Professor R.C. Sinha, the chairman, who cast the die for me. He said, I remember he had come to Shantiniketan in 2000, I think February 2000, when the ICPR conferred the lifetime achievement on me. And Professor Sinha came to preside and came to make the award to me. And immediately after making the award, when we were enjoying tea, Professor Sinha extracted, so to say, a request from me that I have to write on Swarajin ideas. It was really a difficult task for me, but since Professor Sinha was a dear friend of mine, I could not say no to it. But anyway, even then, my progress was very slow. But last year, Professor Sinha gave me sort of warning or notice. He said that you have to finish the paper within a month or two. And that's what I tried to do. And there is no extension granted to me by Professor Sinha. Let me now turn to Swaraj's ideas. My paper on Swaraj's ideas, the dialectic of Indian rationality. Swaraj's ideas was originally Professor K.C. Bhattacharya's address to the students of the college of which he was principal. It was written sometime in the 30s of the last century. Well, about the same time as Swaraj's ideas was delivered as address, there appeared Bhattacharya's classic book on the subject of freedom, containing his 10 lectures at the Indian Institute of Philosophy, Avalder, in 1929-30. On a close reading of it, Swaraj's ideas appears to contain the hints of Professor Bhattacharya's theory of subjective freedom. The incipient or core subjectivity of Bhattacharya's contention in this paper and Bhattacharya's critique of Western rationalism, which undermined the subject nations, that is India's subject, that it implies, would be lost if the reader of this paper or is not understood or does not understand it at the background of the book Subject as Freedom. After all, self, better, the subject to the Indian mind is but realized self. It is for the Indian realization as at its acme. Let us recall to ourselves the Upanishad distinction of grades of consciousness, Jagrat, Sapna, Sushupti, Turiya, in which Turiya is understood as realization of consciousness to itself as self and to itself as not self. Self as realization in its acme is not idea as in Hegel or Hegel's rationalism, or not even is it idea of reason as in Kant. It is unfortunate that the distinctive Indian notion of self as realization, which is the main thrust of Professor Bhattacharya's book on the subject of freedom, and which underlies the lecture on the Swaraj's ideas, is wholly ignored in the different articles on this lecture in the special volume of the Indian Philosophical Quarterly in 1982. These were papers by very competent scholars, but unfortunately, it is unfortunate that the distinctive Indian notion of self as realization, the quintessence of self as realization, which underlies this paper, Swaraj's idea, that was not highlighted. After all, the lived subject, I say it is lived subject of the nation, was long suppressed by the colonial rulers. And so it will be in the fitness of things today, when the nation is celebrating the 75th year of its freedom, if this lecture on Swaraj's ideas is understood at the background of the book or the classic book, The Subject of Freedom. Apparently, the emphasis of Swaraj's ideas is on the need of distinctive idiom that Indian thought must develop as counter to Western idioms, in which Indian thought had been largely interpreted, or rather misinterpreted. But much deeper is for Bhattacharya the requirement for Indian thought here. Under the influence of our colonial masters, still ruling India when Bhattacharya delivered his address, Indian thought would be largely understood in Western terms. If not found to be amenable to an Western interpretation, it would be rejected as not worth pursuing for the cultured cognoscenti. Basic to such Western interpretation was the Western concept of reason. To the extent Indian thought could be interpreted rationally according to the Western is estimate of rational, to the extent Indian thought could be interpreted rationally, it would be worth pursuing for the so-called enlightened. Otherwise, Indian thought would just be dismissed as irrational, dogmatic, the pursuit and puerile, the pursuit of which would better be consigned to the dark chambers of the mind of the so-called deity. For the upper echelons of Indian society, who would only sustain themselves by taking refuge in the so-called rationalism of the West, Indian thought was irrational, dogmatic, puerile, childish, and had better to be substituted by Western rationalism, as though rationalism of the West was the paradigm for philosophical or any other kind of discourse worth the name of intellectual or philosophical discourse. On the contrary, the paper Swaraj ideas hinted at a broader philosophical theory of reason. Mind you, Swaraj ideas hinted at a broader philosophical theory of reason, not contradicting the Western concept of reason, but accommodating the Western concept of reason. Indeed, Professor Bhattacharya welcomes the rationalizing movement of his days coming from the West and urged that Indian speculations must be part of the movement. However, rationalism must not be unregenerate, as it was conceived to be in the West, but on the contrary, must be broad, allowing for different shades, consistent with the mentality or the spirit of a nation. This is demonstrated by the way systems of Indian thought themselves have developed. There was, between the thought systems or philosophical systems, controversies and debates which were unending, and yet the controversies developed in such a way that the opponent's point of view could be appreciated from a distance, that is, by rival systems. Allowing for such dialectical encounter between different systems of Indian thought can be at the farthest remove from any solipsistic nourishment of a nation, particularly the Indian or the revivalist point of view, or even iconoclastic stance against non-indigenous thought. India has always been very broad in that respect. It is not India has been iconoclastic. It is not that India has ever been revivalistic. I want to register my protest against those who have proposed a revivalistic interpretation of Indian history or Indian thought. Indian philosophy has never been revivalistic because of the very dynamicity of the philosophical process in India. Am I audible?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. Three trends can be distinguished in India's encounter with the West. Three traits. In the first period of the encounter, the dominance of Western mentality over Indian mind can be discerned, and discerned very clearly. This was the period when the colonialists dominated over our culture, outlook, mentality, and philosophy. Any Indian thought, more so philosophy, would have to be seen through the Western prism. It must be noted here that in this respect, there were apologists of the Indian tradition among the Indians too. To the extent Indian thought, ideas and customs and philosophy could be interpreted in Western terms, to that extent only it could command world's attention. At least this was the mentality or mentality of the colonialists and the apologists of the Indian thought vis-a-vis colonial thought. And to the extent Indian thought could not be cast in colonial terms or the colonial rationalistic terms, it was not worth the attention of our colonial masters. Of course, we have to admit that even during those colonial times, there were great savants of learning like William Jones, Max Muller, and the great Orientalists. But then the over-dominance of Western thought over Indian thought or Indian outlook reigned over the academic or the intellectual atmosphere. Indian thought was acceptable only to the extent, and to that extent only, if it could be cast in the Western mold. It was to be relegated if it was not cast in the, if it could not be cast in the Western mold or Western idioms, if it was not amenable to Western interpretation, it was to be relegated to oblivion. What is more, what could not be fitted into the West's much vaunted rationalistic framework would be undermined or rejected as irrational, dogmatic, too commonplace to be attended to. We shall come back to a somewhat detailed discussion of Western rationalism after trying to situate Indian thought in the currents of thought coming from the West. Meanwhile, let us distinguish the second trend of thought in India's encounter with the West, with reference particularly to philosophy. Almost overawed by the advocates of Western rationalism, especially their attitude to Indian philosophical thought, the Indian reaction was but a vainglorious propagation of Indian thought. We too have a philosophy like yours. This was how the apologists of the Indian thought and Indian tradition would react against the advocates of the super dominance of Western thought over Indian philosophical thought in superlative terms. It was forgotten that philosophy, whatever may be the place of its origin, whatever may be its geographical locale, cannot be advocated by a mere propagandist avowal of it. That one's claim to having a philosophy must be backed by philosophizing on one's own tradition. That to accept a tradition is not to be a traditionalist. That one's tradition has to be, as it was laudably, continually created and recreated. That one has to live one's tradition if one has to advocate it livingly and with what attention. Quite naturally, the dogmatic assertion of Indian philosophy without being engaged in it could not be of any avail in countering the advancing Western thought. The assertion should have been a reasoned one. But just such reasoning on Indian philosophy would be undermined by colonialists. For them, the reasoning that would count was their reasoning. The reason that would count was their reasoning. What was the basic rationalistic philosophy of the West? By and large, it was Hegelian. Hegel's sweeping dialectic, which would undermine sensibility vis-a-vis reason, is in sharp contrast to Kant's theory of sensibility and understanding. For Hegel, reason in its sweeping dialectic undermines the distinct function of sensibility. For Kant, sensibility can only intuit and understanding can only conceive. In other words, for Kant, sensibility cannot conceive and understanding cannot intuit. On the contrary, for Hegel, intuitive intelligence is possible. Reason, in its dialectical march, incorporates sensibility, according to Hegel, within itself. In its highest dialectical stage, reason for Hegel becomes intuitive. But as Professor K.C. Bhattacharya pointed out in 1916 in his paper on the place of the indefinite in logic, reason cannot explain the particularity or the contingency of the given. Let me read it once again. Reason cannot explain the particularity or the contingency of the given. This was the long and short of Professor K.C. Bhattacharya's criticism of Western rationalistic Hegelian dialectic. Bhattacharya's attack on Western rationalism is accentuated in his paper, again, some aspects of negation. Hegel's sweeping dialectic had its impact on his interpretation of what would appear to be non-rational in other modes of thinking, or other cultures, or other philosophies, which could not be fitted into his rationalistic dialectic. Animistic, naturalistic, polytheistic religions would either be squeezed into his dialectic framework or be relegated into nothing. This over-rationalism had contrary reactions from the side of philosophy of nations, which are different from his own German tradition, India included. Let us remember in this connection that Kant of Germany itself would not accept Hegel's over-rationalism. The Indian perspective with regard to Hegel was formulated clearly, philosophically, in 1916 by Professor K.C. Bhattacharya in his classic paper, The Place of the Indefinite in Logic. Dialectic, according to Bhattacharya, cannot do away with the indefiniteness of the given. Kantian teaching of the dualism of understanding and sensibility seems to reappear here in the Indian philosopher's thinking. Reason is not to be understood in the thinking of Kant and Bhattacharya as a closed system. It is open textured. And now the field comes to be open to Indian philosophy and its different systems. Indeed, the variety of systems of Indian philosophical thought thriving at different periods of time is a pointer to the idea of the many-sidedness of reason. India can lay claim or lay credit for having advanced the idea of the many-sidedness of reason. That is why the philosopher in Bhattacharya could declare in his paper Swaraj ideas that while we cannot ignore the beacon lights coming from the West, we have to accept or reject them after an open-eyed struggle, quote unquote, open-eyed struggle between Indian thought and Western thought. And here begins the third stage of our encounter with the West. Here too begins the creative phase of India's encounter with the West. Two important considerations have to be attended to at this point. The first consideration relates to the fact of parallel course of development of different schools of Indian philosophy, Nyaya, Vedanta, Sankhya, Mimamsa, and so on. These schools have been constantly, rather unendingly dialectical in relation to one another. On each of these schools, there are bhashyas, tikas, toshatikas, and so on, unendingly. Any scholar of Indian philosophy would just marvel at this fact. Each system of thought has, from within itself, generated a dialectic, in virtue of which its rival thought is entertained in thought. And as often as this dialectic is formulated, as often as it does come to be controverted. And again, the system comes to be entertained in thought. The most important fact about this movement from one position to a counter position and then on to the reaffirmation of the position is that it is not just a story or history of philosophical jugglery. What this fact importantly points to is the philosophic idea, uniquely Indian, that philosophical dialectic is not structured. Philosophical debates were never structured in India. That's why philosophical debates were always open to counter philosophical thought. It must be open-ended. If a philosophical name has to be given to it, then the name which was proposed by Professor K.C. Bhattacharya should be the name for it. I mean alternation. And again, alternation here is that logical alternation between disjunctives, which are exclusive. Indian philosophical dialectic has throughout been inclusive, and that unendingly. Mark my words. Indian philosophical dialectic has throughout been inclusive, and that unendingly. This is something unique to Indian thought, especially to Indian dialectic, markedly non-Hegelian and overreaching the Hegelian and also the Marxian dialectic of contradiction. To go further still with the idea of the Indian dialectic of reason, dialectic was spread or practiced not just between systems of philosophy, but more importantly within the systems. Tikas were different, Toshatikas were different within the systems themselves. Toshatikas, for example, themselves had to face counter tikas from within the same school. What generated such unending dialectic was not reveling with intellectual gymnastics, but, and this is philosophically most important, the idea that truth is manifold, uniquely Indian idea. That India could be won in spite of all the vicissitudes and turmoil down the ages was because of its firm belief that truth is manifold. Mark my words, that India could be won in spite of all the vicissitudes of and turmoil down the ages was because of its firm belief that truth is manifold. If the West had the dialectic of contradiction, India had a more comprehensive dialectic of alternation. It is from within this dialectic of alternation that systems of Indian philosophy have sprung up. A painstaking study of Professor K.C. Bhattacharya's paper on the concept of the absolute and its alternative forms may bring home to one the idea of alternation of systems. Can the Indian darshanas be regarded as systems with the system idea we are accustomed to from the West? We associated the idea of closed structures, thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. But living dynamic systems that the Indian darshanas were, they had no room for the idea of system. Living or generative systems are not static. For the Indian philosophers, truth generates itself, shata, from within itself. We thus see how much of philosophical thought is embedded in Swarajian ideas. And we also have been trying to see that underlying this paper is the spirit of Bhattacharya's and India's philosophizing. Question may be asked at this point, alternatives are mutually exclusive and jointly exhaustive. How can one view the generation of alternative systems alongside one another? The philosopher has already taken his firm stand on the distinction between alternation and alternatives. Alternatives are mutually exclusive and jointly exhaustive. K.C. Bhattacharya has nothing to do with alternatives, but with the concept of alternation, alternation within consciousness. Alternatives are mutually exclusive and jointly exhaustive. Outside them, no room is left for further thought. In the present context of discussion, however, a given darshana finds advocates differing respectively from each other. Within the same Vedanta, for example, we have followers of Vachaspati Mishra, Padma Padacharya. So too have other darshanas, each having different advocates, but swearing by the same darshana. Indeed, Indian philosophy presents the living spectacle of living dynamic interpretations. Varied though these interpretations have been, they yet thrive within the same climate of philosophical thought. Interpretations vary within the same horizon of thought, a la Gadamer. Each interpretation blooming within the same spectrum. Each advocate of the same darshana enjoys his distinctive freedom. How do you like it, Paneer Silvam?
Fine. Very. I liked it.
Thank you. This is the idea of Swaraj. We can boldly claim here that Professor K.C. Bhattacharya is the representative of the third distinct trend of our encounter with the West. It was he who alone brought it home to us in modern times that pursuit of history of philosophy, Indian, Western, or whatever, is not the reading of the story of philosophy, contrast Will Durant, but is a living encounter with the philosophers through which they appear anew to us, inasmuch as their ideas are interpreted philosophically. Let me divert from my paper a little. I had the fortune to study at the feet of two greatest philosophers of the 20th century, Professor Kalidas Bhattacharya and Professor Gopinath Bhattacharya. And they would never just content with mentioning a particular standpoint. They would always try to find out something opposite to that particular standpoint. And then again, they would ask questions of the students. They would ask questions of the students in the class itself. Am I right or am I not? I remember on one occasion, my friend, he was officer with the Calcutta port. Later on, my friend pointed out to Professor Gopinath Bhattacharya, sir, relation and terms, they presuppose each other. And then Professor Bhattacharya immediately countered, what of that? He said, because they presuppose each other, therefore there is a vicious circle. Immediately, my teacher, Professor Gopinath Bhattacharya, retorted, is every instance of mutual presupposition a case of vicious circle? We are all puzzled. Then he favored us with an example. He asked my friend, well, suppose I borrow money from you in order to pay you. Can you accept that? Well, then he said, well, this and this is the paradigm example of a mutual presupposition and the vicious circle together. So not every mutual presupposition is a case of vicious circle. Bhattacharya's approach to the study of philosophers became a model of independent philosophizing for his sons, the late Professors Gopinath Bhattacharya and Kalidas Bhattacharya. Their style of analysis in the early 40s and the late 50s in turn inspired many of their students, including myself, who could independently strike out new modes of philosophical thinking in continuation with the then prevalent thought and making new accretions to the philosophical thought that persists even today. Kalidas Bhattacharya's survey of the controversy between idealism and realism in his class lectures in the 50s of the last century can today be situated in Putnam's distinction between internal and external realism and indicate the larger dimension in which the controversy between realism and idealism may be reviewed and reconstructed and reordered. A nation which could conceive of non-structured and alternative forms of philosophy, of many competing darshanas side by side, must be credited with being Catholic. Of course, Catholicism is distinctly Indian. Its spirit continues to pervade the thinking of a whole host of present-day Indian philosophers in our old seminaries of philosophical discussion, the tolas of the present-day universities. Unfortunately, emphasis is not placed so much on the tolas as was desirable. It may be said that in many centers of learning, there is still a culture of Vedanta, Nyaya, Mimamsa, and so on and so forth, without the emergence of any creative philosophy. But then, these systems have not got rusted in old, modern scholarship. On the contrary, the so-called old scholarship renews itself continuously through exegesis on our philosophical systems by our referred panditas. Creativity through exegesis or philosophical constructions is always situated in the old, which appears new through unending constructions or reconstructions. Let me read this sentence once again. Creativity through exegesis or philosophical constructions is always situated in the old, which appears new through unending philosophical constructions. The fact that our revered Panditas continue responding to present-day philosophical discourses, more importantly, construct distinct discourse patterns, is evidence on the one hand of our living dialectical tradition, and on the other of the openness of Indian philosophical thought and culture. I remember on one occasion when the late Pandit Vishwabandhu Bhattacharya was invited to a seminar on proper names at Jadavpur University. The discussion had been centering around Peter Strawson and Keith Donellan. When their points of view were explained to Pandit Bhattacharya, he immediately responded in his own diction and added to the corpus of Western thought on proper names on which our discussion had been conducted, much to the astonishment of many who were still addicted to Western idioms. On the one hand, our Panditas go on adding to the corpus of Western thinking and even go to the length of adding to the thought of Western philosophy. They have been continuously adding to the accustomed language of mind or mind of language. Professor S.R. Bhatt, for example, is a brilliant example of a philosopher who is stationed in Indian thought and yet creatively reacts or responds to Western thought. One very recent example is Professor Shochi Prabha Kumar's work on categories, creation, and cognition in Vaisheshika philosophy. Let me read out the title of the book, very important book, Categories, Creation, and Cognition in Vaisheshika philosophy. Professor Kumar attempts a comparison between and contrast also between Aristotelian ontology and Vaisheshika ontology. And then she goes further to see how or to show how the Vaisheshika hermeneutics is on the Vedas can be affiliated to hermeneutics in the West. Let me hope that Shoshi Prabha one day or other, very soon, I should say, favors us with a complete book on Vedic hermeneutics. Can we now say, keeping the examples of these philosophers in our mind, that Indian philosophy is moribund, dogmatic, and so on? I am now anticipating an objection. Myself, I am anticipating an objection to my paper. An objection may be raised to my paper on Bhattacharya on Swarajian ideas. It may be pointed out against me that my paper restricts itself mainly, if not wholly, to the issue of reason vis-a-vis freedom. But it may be observed, freedom itself may need to be philosophically analyzed without reference to the concept of reason. And it may be further observed in this collection itself that freedom in the context of Indian philosophical thought has been sought to be understood without reference to our erstwhile colonial rulers who would make a facade of rationalism. Well, what is urged is admittedly relevant. But towards the end of my paper, I have hinted at the extra-rational dimension of freedom. Freedom is not just freeing from something, that is some power, institution, society, or whatever. It has an inner core, which is not only freedom from anything which is being, but more importantly, freedom from the very seeking of freedom. Here I may refer to Bhattacharya's distinction between freedom from the seeking of freedom, and more importantly, freedom from any domination or governance, between freedom from which has got a being and freedom from the seeking of freedom from. Reference is to Bhattacharya's studies in yoga, in studies in philosophy, volume 1. The gamut of the entire reflection of freedom is then this, that freedom in Indian thinking is not only the will to be free from any governance, but freedom even without reference to any governance. Freedom is consciousness of consciousness itself as self to itself, and to itself as not self. Let me read this sentence again. Freedom is consciousness of consciousness itself as self to itself, and to itself as not self. This is the Vedantic idea of self. Vedanta here strikes a distinct dimension. Self as the subject for Vedanta is distinguished from object, Vishaya. Here Vedanta is as theory of self or the subject, distinct from the Nyaya or the Prabhakara Mimamsa. The Vedantis contrast to the Nyaya theory of Anubhavashaya and Prabhakara theory of Tripati Sangvit may here be fruitful. According to Nyaya, self-consciousness is secondary consciousness, that is retrospective consciousness or primary consciousness as object to the retrospective consciousness, which again may be object to a further retrospective consciousness. And according to Prabhakara Mimamsa, self-consciousness is Tripati Sangvit, that is triune consciousness of one, consciousness of consciousness, two, consciousness of the object of which consciousness is directed, and self. In the Vedanta view, however, both these views ignore the distinct dimension of consciousness or self-consciousness from object consciousness. I remember when we were students of Calcutta University, my teacher, Professor Kaliraj Bhattacharya, was giving a course of lectures on the controversy between realism and idealism. But when he wrote, he did say something which is very important, which he mentioned in the class. He said, after all, the distinction between realism and idealism is a distinction of grades of consciousness. But when his work was published, he didn't mention the concept of grades. I immediately went to him and said, sir, you told us so many things about grade, and you told us that the distinction between, or situated, the controversy between realism and idealism may be situated at the background of the distinction of grades. But then, why is it that you didn't mention this paper, mention this in your book? He said, Bakshi, you must remember that we are both teachers. Somehow or other, we have to publish our book. And then we can get an increase of pay to the extent of only 10 rupees. So that was tragic that India could not honor its teachers. According to the Prabhakarami Ongshaten, self-consciousness is Tripurti Sangvit of triune consciousness, which is one, consciousness of consciousness, two, consciousness of object to which consciousness is directed, and three, consciousness of the self. In the Vedanta view, however, both these views ignore the distinct dimension or distinct order of consciousness or self-consciousness from object consciousness. Vedanta would agree with Wittgenstein that self shows itself, but then it would go further from Wittgenstein and add self shows itself to itself as self and not as not self. Nor again would Vedanta agree with the Prabhakara Mimamsa that self shows itself to itself as object. Vedanta would reply that Sasangvedya of or Sasangvedyata of self goes against this Vishayata. It is on this distinct dimension of self or self-consciousness that Vedanta would found epistemology, or as a doctrine of self or self-consciousness. And it is just on this dimension that Vedanta, for that matter, or Indian thought for that matter, would view freedom. Freedom is not only not object, but not even free from object. My freedom is my holy will. That cannot be sullied, that cannot be tainted by any governance from outside. It was this freedom of ours that was tainted during the British rule. India's message here to the world at large will be to echo Kant's message, quote, so act as to treat humanity, whether in thy own person or in the person of others, always as an end and never as a means. India's efforts should be towards the consolidation of the holy will that our saints have worshipped over the ages, and our saints are even now worshipping. We can only stand our own only if we pay respect to our saints and also pay respects to the indigenous tradition in which Indian philosophy has thrived to the benefit of the world. Thank you very much, all. Thanks to all of you. And
Thank you. Wonderful, sir. Wonderful.
Thank you very much. You made me a prisoner, Professor Sinha.
No, this is a wonderful.
Today I feel free at long last.
And you have presented it in a very sound and in a sound voice, very sound voice.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Professor Bagchi. And
thank you.
We'll open this session for the question. We would like to invite Madam Professor Shashi Prabhakar, Honorable Chairperson IIS Shimla, for
That's
and
fine.
after that we'll open this session for the discussion. So kindly please all of you, those who have some queries and suggestions and all the things, please write down and we'll take after this. So we would like to invite
Mr. Chairperson, sir, I would request that first let the questions take place, because there will be a continuity. Because yeah,
Right.
Okay, if sir permit, then we
it
can.
is up to the I'm requesting the chairperson how he desires.
No,
I'll
but
obey his direction, please.
okay, if you desire, that
I
is
think that will be inconvenient. Otherwise, that will be
okay.
fine.
You
Because
invite some
I will be
questions,
speaking in a different
and
direction.
then Professor Shashi Prabha will speak, and then certainly,
May I ask a question, sir?
Yes, please.
yes, please
Yeah,
introduce yourself and ask, sir.
I am Alok Tandon. I am really, I must say, totally so much impressed by the presentation of Professor Bagchi, whom I heard long back in Shantiniketan once in Akhil Bharatiya Darshan Parishad conference. But today, the way he has expounded the idea of freedom in Indian philosophy, I think it requires a lot of discussion and consideration for us as we are moving towards the celebration of our freedom. But my question is just a very simple one, and that is related to how you will reflect or how you will relate the Gandhian idea of Swaraj as propounded in Hindu Swaraj with the idea of Swaraj in ideas of Professor K.C. Bhattacharya. Because
Well,
Gandhi never talked about these philosophical systems very much. Still, he talked about the idea of Swaraj as self-rule and the rule of our own people. So how to relate both the ideas? Because unless we relate the idea of freedom in consciousness with the idea of freedom in social sphere, I think the discussion will remain incomplete. Thank you.
Yes, yes. Thank you very much. Well, first of all, towards the end of my paper itself, I have said that, and I think this is also equal, that I'm an end in myself. I'm an end in myself. Gandhi would never depart from this idea of a person being an end in himself or end in herself. So I am an end in myself, so to say. And in that connection, I have quoted Kant, so act as to treat humanity, whether in thy own person or in the person of others, always as an end and never as a means. That is what I have said. And secondly, during our struggle with the British, particularly the British colonialists, Gandhi's the emphasis throughout had been that you must quit India. We shall be able to settle our own affairs by ourselves. And Gandhi was to that extent very severe on the Western rulers. You first of all quit India. Why? Not only that you quit India with bags and baggages. Gandhi had a lot of friends among the Westerners, mind you. He was more Westerner than one of us. He was more Westerner than any one of us. But at the same time, Gandhi was stationed in Indian mind. And Gandhi said, we will settle, we will do our, we will, so to say, be the architect of our freedom according to our own genius. That is what I have tried to point out today.
Can I ask something?
Please do,
Yes,
Silva.
please,
Yeah.
Professor Paneer Selvam.
Yeah. Honorable Professor Bakshi sir, respected Madam Shashi Prabhaji, Professor Ramesh Chandra Sinha ji, and other friends. Today I heard a very, very stimulating and thought-provoking lecture. So I am grateful to Professor Bakshi ji and Professor Sinha ji, who has made proper arrangement for this interesting lecture. Professor Bakshi, I have a few questions.
Well, on this Silvam, there is one interruption. You should be more grateful to Professor Sinha than to myself. I have today attained freedom, at least.
Sir, thank you for highlighting the Indian notion of rationality. This is something very, really remarkable. But, sir, there is a criticism. Of course, it's not a valid one. There is a criticism that in contemporary Indian philosophy, there is no proper contribution, or say, let us say, originality. Of course, though I don't accept this criticism fully, there are certain aspects which we have to take into account. Quite often, it is said by many of our scholars that in contemporary Indian philosophy, we find only an interpretation of the classical Indian systems. In fact, you made a reference to Gadamer, which is very interesting, that how interpretation has been playing a very important role. How would you answer these critics? I'm not one among them, but these criticisms cannot be ignored. Though we say thinkers like Subhijibin Bhattacharya, Professor R. Balasubramanian, and many others like Jayan Mohanty and many others have made a contribution in contemporary Indian philosophy. The criticism is that there is no originality. They are repeating, or they have been interpreting the classical Indian systems, is to be addressed by us. We cannot simply ignore that. What would be your answer to this? And secondly, the dialectic of rationality, that is, you made a comparison between Western and Indian notion of rationality, and you have pointed out that there are certain flaws in Western rationality. But sir, if you look at the postmodern tradition, they have very clearly pointed out the problems with regard to the Western rationality, and they have argued that it has to be replaced or it has to be rejected. So in this context, I think the Indian concept of rationality would be very apt. So what would you think that this rationality could be the basic understanding of Indian philosophy? In other words, how this notion of rationality could be related to Indian philosophical discourse. And thirdly, sir, it is very right on your part to point out the dialectic of alternation. This is something really remarkable, and you have highlighted it in such a way that it definitely would attract all our young scholars who have been talking about or they don't show that much interest in Indian philosophy. And I feel that if somebody reads your understanding of the dialectic of alternation of KCB, then our Indian philosophers or our students of Indian philosophy would appreciate the way in which Indian philosophers have been doing Indian philosophy. So I think your approach to KCB has given a new vision for understanding Indian philosophical discourse, and I congratulate you for exhibiting Casey's philosophy in a very beautiful way. We are very much grateful to you. Very grateful to you for expounding that in an extraordinary manner. Of course, we have been talking about over the phone on this matter some months ago also, but I am very much fascinated the way in which you have elaborated. Thank you very much.
So, do you want me to intercede?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Panir Silvam, I have already or partially, so to say, taken guard of what you say. I have told you, or I have said in my paper, I have written in my paper, that criticism, philosophy is nothing but criticism. But at the same time, let us remember, criticism is within a locale, within a situation. And it is on that situation or the locale that you are constantly rationalizing, and it is that locale that you are rationalizing. You are rationalizing within a locale, and you are rationalizing the local. Thereby, you are adding to the corpus of the local, you are adding to the corpus of the horizon of thought. So, I'm thankful to you that you attended to my observations on Gadamer. Even Gadamer would say that all interventions or all philosophical controversies are within a horizon. Here, Husserl's concept of horizon is horizon. And Indians are of different varieties, whatever may be their pursuits, Indians of different varieties have always tried to understand their points of view within a horizon, but they have never been, so to say, tacked to the horizon. They have also tried to uh, transcend that horizon.
Thanks, sir.
Yes.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
How are you, Asha?
I'm fine, thank you, Kalanda. It was such a pleasure and a delight to listen to you.
Thank you.
As fresh as I could hear you 40 years back, so it's a wonderful experience, I can say.
I'm now 90.
Great, great. Great, Kalanda. I have just two clarifications to seek. I mean, I've really thoroughly enjoyed your lecture. But then I just need some clarification. One is regarding the Indian dialectics. The way you have explained the Indian dialectics, it's basically comes to very closer to having the arguments and counter arguments, the tradition of arguments and counter arguments, which often Amartya Sen has talked about, Daya Krishna has talked about, many other people have also talked about the dialogue aspect of within the system and outside the system, the various systems which originated in the Indian tradition. Now, the thing is that these dialogues and the arguments and counter arguments, this is not only peculiar to Indian tradition. I guess this is this is actually present in every tradition. I mean, if you look at Chinese tradition, if you look at Greek tradition, if you look at any ancient tradition, you will find this that the dialogue aspects. So, but then you have also gone little ahead, and you talked about the living, aspect into the Indian tradition. That it's not something which is dead. Well, the dialogue itself is never dead, because after all, the argument and by the nature of philosophy, the concept using the concept of philosophy itself, the dialogue aspect must continue. So that is, if that is the true, then in every tradition the dialogue is also continuing. I mean, like, I'm familiar of my own tradition, but I mean, people from Arabic tradition, they are familiar of their Arabic tradition. They are also continuing with this dialogue. In many other traditions, I mean, you can look at any tradition. Now, so what I'm saying is that the aspects of Indian tradition or Indian dialectics which you are emphasizing, they are present in every other tradition. Now, if that is the case, how do you distinguish this Indian dialectics from any other dialectics? That's one question. The second is regarding the reconstruction. You have talked about interpretation, reconstruction, and that aspect. Again, I suppose I would seek your clarification to develop a kind of distinctive aspect of the Indian reconstruction, which actually and you gave the examples of Professor S.R. Bhatt and Professor Shashi.
Professor Shashi Prabha Kumar.
Yes, and she's in our panel. In a few minutes, we are going to listen to her. A great scholar, both of them. But then, this reconstruction part. The question is of reconstruction. I mean, not all reconstructions are actually accepted within the tradition also. So when we are talking about reconstructions, I mean, there could be a number of reconstructions, but the question is which reconstruction is acceptable within that particular tradition and which one is not. So just by the fact of having the reconstruction does not make it distinctive kind of, and reconstruction is present in every tradition. So if we look at the whole world traditions, I don't know how many traditions we have in the world, but you will find reconstructions every tradition. So the kind of distinctive aspect which you are talking about of Indian dialectics does not stand alone it's not true only about Indian tradition. It is true about any other tradition, any other dialectics, any other reconstruction. I would like to have your opinion.
Well, Asha, it was far from my intention to say that other traditions do not reconstruct. I do admit that the other Arabic tradition, for example, they themselves reconstruct within their own tradition. Well, and they add to their own tradition by way of reconstruction, by way of touching analysis of their own points of view. The point is that what I was trying to do or trying to say is that, well, this tradition of reconstructing, so to say, well, which was very alive in our tradition has been undermined by many of the Western interpreters. This is what I wanted to say. I am not saying in the other traditions there has not been reconstruction. As a matter of fact, if a tradition, you see, to carry on a tradition is not to be a traditionalist. Yes, you understand my point. To carry on a tradition is not to be a traditionalist.
No, sure. I mean, that's
Yes,
very well said.
yes.
Yeah.
Say, within the same tradition, there have been, so to say, counter positions, then counter positions, and that makes the tradition living. And I have not said that India or will not accept that other traditions are not living. Well, they have been living. The need for highlighting the tradition or the creative tradition in Indian philosophy has arisen today when we are independent. This is what I wanted to say.
Thank you. Thank you for the clarification.
Thank you.
Hello.
Professor Dave, it seems you have something.
Professor Dave, have you got something to say?
Can you hear me? I just want to say, sir, that the freedom of thought is so well explained in all our Prasthantrayi. When, yes. After, the giving, all the lectures, the teacher at the end says, Yani asmakam sucharitani, tani tvaya sevitavyani na itrani. Whatever good, I said is acceptable to you, you accept it. That is freedom. And at the end of Bhagavad Gita, Lord says, Iti te gnanam akhyatam guhyat guhyataram maya vimrushya etad asheshana yatha ichchasi tatha kuru. We have given full freedom. And therefore it is says, Adhyatma vidya vidyanam, vadah pravadatamaham. So, this is the kind of freedom that we had. And I hope it will continue. That is all. But I am very thankful to you for your lecture. Thank you.
Thank you very much. But Professor Dave,
yes.
What you say really supports my contention in my paper. I always said, or I have been trying to see, that in India had a very living tradition of dialectics.
Yes.
And that has been undermined by the West, or those of us who have been so much, say, reliant on the Western understanding of Indian philosophy, so to say.
Yes.
Once I asked my teacher, Professor Kalidas Bhattacharya, say, today, I told him, today, sir, Rig Veda has become as much alien to us as Peter Strawson is. And then Kalidas Bhattacharya, my teacher, immediately, when we were coming out of the seminar, he said, that is really tragic, that Rig Veda is alien to us as much as, or Rig Veda is not less alien to us than Peter Strawson. Thank you very much. So, any other intervention, Professor Sinha?
Yeah. Pooja.
Yes, sir. If there is no question, now we move for the another step in our program, and we would like to invite Madam Professor Shashi Prabha Kumar for her perspective.
नमः सर्वेभ्यः, नमः सर्वाभ्यश्च, नमः पूर्वेभ्यः ऋषिभ्यः पथिकृद्भ्यश्च. I am grateful to the ICPR team, the Chairman Professor R.C. Sinha ji, Member Secretary Professor Sachidanand Mishra ji, and the Academic Director Dr. Pooja Vyas for giving me this opportunity to listen to an illuminating lecture by respected Professor K.K. Bagchi. I have been fortunate enough to have him as my elder brother, as a scholar, as a mentor, and incidentally, it was in a seminar on Swaraj, which was I mentioned when I was paying my tribute to Professor D.P. Chattopadhyay. The seminar was organized by Professor D.P. Chattopadhyay, and I met Professor K.K. Bagchi in that seminar on Swaraj. And today again, I am seeing him, listening to him after so many years. And again, he's talking about Swaraj in Ideas, an essay by Professor K.C. Bhattacharya. It was a sheer delight to listen to him, because not only he explained the ideas of K.C. Bhattacharya, but he also threw a light on the various dynamics of Indian philosophical tradition. And I was really impressed by some of his interpretations and his explanations about this parallel development of Indian philosophical systems, the Indian dialectics, and freedom within the dialectic tradition. Then the distinctive Indian notion of the self, that is the spirit of India, and some of his assertions that Indian philosophy has never been revivalistic. It has been a living dynamism. And his interpretation, as Professor Paneer Selvam also mentioned, about alternatives and alternation. He explained beautifully that one is mutually exclusive while other is not. When mutual presuppositions, openness of Indian thought, reason vis-a-vis freedom, and last but not the least, he explained the very idea of freedom, and taking a cue from where he left, this very idea of freedom within oneself. That is what I will try to explain in a Vedic narrative or in a Vedic background. You see, the term Swaraj in Ideas, it is simply the idea of a spiritual interpretation of Swaraj. This was done by you, sir, in a social and political context, but I will try to throw some light on its spiritual aspect, to which Professor Dave also suggested a little bit from the Vedanta and Upanishads. As we know, the term Swarajya, it is the root word. Now we talk of Swaraja, which is a colloquial rendering of the same, but the root word is Swarajya, and it is derived from the root Rat. Swarat. Rat is to illumine, to shine forth. Svena rajate sah swarat, tasya bhavaha swarajyam. So Swarat is a person who is self-luminous, self-radiant, self-reliant, to use the term which is so made popular by our Atmanirbhar Bharat. The country can only be self-reliant when its citizens are self-radiant. When they are Swaraj, only then we can have true Swarajya. So there is a Vedic dictum, Vedic formula of interpretation. There is a which says Yat Pinde Tat Brahmande. Pinda is the individual, and Brahmanda is the collective group or society or a nation. So whatever we have to have in a group, we must inculcate or interpret with reference to the individual. So if the individual is self-reliant, self-radiant, only then can a nation be self-reliant and self-radiant. And you rightly pointed out that the colonial impact on our mindset, on our thought patterns has been so pervasive that we have forgotten to think freely, think of freedom, think in a free manner, and to engage in dialectics in the traditional Indian way that was there within the schools and outside the schools. So inter-school and intra-school debates were constantly there. And the question that Professor Paneer Selvam raised, it was a very important question that today there is no originality in contemporary Indian philosophy. But I think the answer given by a scholar of 10th century, he was Jayanta Bhatta, who wrote the text Nyaya Manjari. So in Indian tradition, the continuity, the thread of continuity is more important than novelty. Novelty is, of course, there in the presentation itself. Just like we heard today to the essay by K.C. Bhattacharya, Swaraj in Ideas, but it was a presentation and interpretation by Professor Kalyan Kumar Bagchi. Wasn't it a novel interpretation? the presentation itself made it so more enjoyable than reading the article sitting in solitude. But when a teacher explains this in his or her own inimitable style, it makes a novelty, it makes a unique experience. Then the Bhatta says, in the very beginning of his text, he says, Kuto va nutanam vastu, vayam prekshitum kshamaha, vasto vinyasa vaichitriya matra matra vicharyatam. We cannot innovate to such an extent that new theory, a new paradigm we can invent. We can only represent the truth which has been stated by our ancestors. We can only present it in a new style, in new idiom, and a new language. I think the contribution of contemporary Indian philosophy may not appear to be original at the moment, but there are some original strands in contemporary Indian philosophy also, which will be coming to light later when they are presented in such a way that we are able to grasp their essence. Like this essay or the whole literature of K.C. Bhattacharya, his ideas on freedom, ideas on Swaraj, like they were presented by the speaker today. Similarly, some other speaker, some other day might present his or her own interpretation, which will also throw some new light, some fresh insights will be available there. So there is a notion of originality which is different in the West and is different in the Indian tradition. Because here we do not see philosophy as an original idea of an individual. Here it is a continuous tradition which we call sampradaya. What is a sampradaya? Udyotakara in his Nyaya-Vartika says, Sampradayo nama acharya shishyayoho avichedena sambandha prakti.
Right.
When there is no break in the tradition, the teacher directly teaches the disciple, and the disciple again becomes a teacher because it is a sampradaya, sampradiyate, which is transmitted well. That heritage is known as sampradaya. So ours has been an oral tradition, Shruti Parampara. Therefore, taking some cue from this, I go back to the idea of Rajya in Vedic perspective. So as I mentioned, the term is Swaraj, an individual who is self-luminous, self-radiant. Self-radiance comes when somebody is in control or he or she is self-disciplined. And if we go to Chanakya, Kautilya, in the very beginning of his Artha Shastra, he says, Kritsnamidam Shastram Indriya Jayah Tad Viruddha Vritti Ravishendriyah Chaturantopi Raja Sadyo Vinashyati. Although the Artha Shastra has been a treatise of diplomacy, of governance, of economics and policy, but he says, Kritsnam hi shastram idam indriya jayah. My shastra is about ruling oneself, governing oneself. If a king is not governing himself, if he is not able to control himself, then even though he might have a long kingdom, Chaturantopi Raja Sadyah Vinashyati, he will not succeed if he is not able to control himself. So the very notion of Swarajya implies that one should be in control of his or her senses. That is what the Upanishads and the Gita have been teaching us, that once control over the sense organs, then on the control over mind, which is known as yoga chitta vritti nirodha. So this individual control over oneself will make a person Swarat, and when all of us, the group, becomes Swarat, then there can be a presupposition of Swarajya, a state of people who are Swarat, who are self-radiant, self-reliant, can occur only when each one of us does some endeavor for this actualization of this goal. In this background, Swarajya has to be understood as a principle of perfection for the individual to develop all his potential powers to the fullest possible extent. From this point of view, the concept of Swarajya has a self-referent application. It is not only applicable to the national or civic order of a particular locale or a place, as suggested by many of the scholars, but also to the internal government within a person himself. So this idea of internal government, and this is available in the Chandogya Upanishad. We have a whole hymn in Rig Veda which is about Swarajya. The term Swarajya occurs in Rig Veda. This is the first mandala 80th hymn, and we have 16 verses about Swarajya, Archan Nanu Swarajyam. This epithet occurs in all the 16 verses. Then in the Chandogya Upanishad, we have a contrast between Swarat and Anyarat. Swarat is one who is self-radiant, and Anyarat is the one who's dependent for his luminosity, for his radiance on the objects or on the external world. So the contrast is shown there between Swaraj and Anyarat. We have this contrast expressed in various parallel terms like Alpa and Bhuma, Martya and Amrita, Tama and Jyoti, Asat and Sat in the Upanishads themselves. So these binary terms actually, they are used to explain the subtle notions of the Bhuma, of the Amrita, of the Swarat. And from Swarat, there is a hint to the Swarat in Upanishads. Swarajya. Swarajya is the self-radiance, and Swarajya is the Swaha Rajya. Swaha means Ananda, bliss. So when there is total bliss, perfect bliss, nothing remains to be achieved. That state of Bhuma, Nalpe Sukham Asti, Yad Bhuma, Yovai Bhuma Tat Sukham. Sukha is not there in the limited, in the finite. It is always to be found in infinite, in Bhuma, that is unlimited. So Yovai Bhuma Tat Sukham, Tat Swarajyam, Swarajyam. It is in the Chandogya Upanishad, Bhuma Prakarana itself, that this term Swarajyam occurs, which says that Indra attains Swarajya. Swaha Rajya. Swaha is Bhur Bhuvaha Swaha. We have the three great utterances or Vyahritis, and Swaha means Ananda, bliss. Sat, Chit and Ananda. Bhu, Bhuvaha and Swaha. So when Sat, Chit and Ananda are in perfect harmony, when the person within himself or herself is in total control of his sense organs, when he is free, so to say, to use the term that Professor Bagchi used towards the end of his paper, when there is complete freedom, freedom from the will to be free, freedom from everything. This is the freedom of the self from all external bondage, all the shackles that try to bind him. This is what we know about Swarajya, and from Swarajya to Swarajya. So I think this spiritual dimension of Swarajya, which is available to us, that reflects in the writings of Mahatma Gandhi, his Hind Swaraj, and that is also reflected in a subtle way in the writings of Professor K.C. Bhattacharya. And these are available in a very subtle way in their writing because they are responding and they are reflecting what is going on around them. The colonial powers are there to crush the mindset of Indians. And the influence has been so strong that till today, we are free, so to say. Politically, we are free. We are celebrating the 75th year of our freedom, but we have to be free from our own inner ignorance, from our own inner subjugation that has been thrust upon us. So I pray and wish that on this occasion we realize this vision of Swarajya, which is there in our tradition, which has been highlighted by scholars like K.C. Bhattacharya and explained by senior Professor Kalyan Kumar Bagchi. I respect him a lot, and I pay my honor to him, pay my grateful pranams to him for presenting this beautiful idea in very lucid style. I think the young scholars who are present here or those who are listening to him, they'll benefit a lot. And teachers like you, sir, are very rare today. And I wish that you have completed 90. May you live a long 100 years. Jivema Sharadaha Shatam. Adinaha Syama Sharadaha Shatam. Namaskar.
Namaste. Haji.
Thank you very much, madam, for giving us the different dimension and Vedic perspective of this idea of Swaraj. We really thankful for your presence and your lecture in this program. If there are any questions or suggestions from the senior professors.
I just have understood very well what does it mean when you say Vade Vade Jayate Tattva Bodha. After listening to two of you, I have understood it very well.
Yeah. Yes, please. Yes, Bhaiya. Haji.
Professor Bagchi, please unmute yourself if you are saying something.
Professor Dave, you want a response? You want me to respond to your statement? Vade Vade Jayate Tattva Bodha. It's so clear, and you have just made a comment, I think.
Yes. She,
After listening to both of you,
he made a comment. Professor Kalyan Kumar Bagchi wants to say something.
but we can't listen.
Professor Bagchi.
Dr. Jagadhar Singh, kindly unmute.
Unmute.
Please unmute yourself. Professor Bagchi, unmute yourself.
जयशंकर जी अनम्यूट कीजिए प्रोफेसर बागची सर को.
हाँ जी, यहाँ से अनम्यूट.
बोलिए.
Yes, Professor Bagchi. But no sound. He is speaking, but we are not listening. Oh, actually, the daughter is away from the room.
Can the host unmute him?
Yeah. That's why I'm asking Dr. Jaishankar to unmute.
Jaishankar ji, can you unmute him?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, sir.
Yes. Now, what I wanted to say is that I accept all the observations and commendable observations of Shashi Prabha. And Shashi Prabha has been my sister from whom I have learned much more than she has learned from me. As a matter of fact, when last year, Professor Sina thrust upon me two onerous tasks, one of writing this paper, and he asked me at the same time when the ICPR gave me the Lifetime Achievement Award. Then Professor Sina himself said that you have to write not only your paper, you have to review this book. So and then I say, is it the price I have to pay for this lifetime achievement? Then he was compelling, so to say. So so I had to review that book. I took so much time to review that book, but anyway, I learned much more from her than she has learned from me. And this is the way Indian tradition has been, so to say, re-noveling itself. There is no fixed novelty, so to say. There is nothing fixed about novelty. It is always creating, or it has been a creative tradition. I mean, Indian tradition has always been creative. Shishya Parampara, and so on. Shishya Guru Parampara, so to say.
Thank you, Dada. If you remember, you wrote a review of my earlier book also. That was given to you by Professor D.P. Chattopadhyay himself.
Actually, he thrust it upon me. And the penalty I had to pay is this: I'll skip the morning session. And in the evening session, in the afternoon session, he caught me, and then he said, "You have to pay the fine. You didn't come in the morning session. Therefore, you have to review this book." So he caught me, so to say.
So,
Thank you, sir. Satyendra ji also wants to ask something. Yes, please, Satyendra.
Yes.
yes, please. Yes, please. Please unmute yourself and introduce yourself also.
Please introduce yourself.
We are not listening.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes.
Yes, now you are audible.
Yes,
Introduce
audible.
yourself
Yes.
and
Thank you so much, sir. I am Satyen from Swaraj College, Delhi University.
Swaraj College, Delhi.
Really, very enriching lecture. I'm grateful to the ICPR that we are organizing such a wonderful lectures and a wonderful theme. My question is that on one hand, we are talking about Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, and we sincerely believe in the idea of the world is one family, or you can say in a different way, globalization. On the other hand, we are talking about Swaraj in ideas, Swaraj in belief system in other way. I remember while I was studying the philosophy of Vivekananda, he said that my idea of Hinduism or religion was completely changed when I read J.S. Mill three essays on religion. And Tolstoy and William James wrote that after reading Vivekananda's Raj Yoga, my interpretation of psychology has been completely changed. And I would like to quote A.L. Basham, and I found it very interesting. It is a quote by A.L. Basham. Okay. I believe that Vivekananda will always be remembered in the world's history because he virtually initiated what the late C.M. Wood once said, the counter attack from the east. I repeat,
That was said by observed by that was what
counter attack from the east. Okay.
yes, counter attack from the east. Sir Francis.
Teacher to
Well,
make an impression
excuse
outside
me.
India.
Excuse me.
I think there is apparent contradiction. That is, on
No.
one hand, we are saying that the idea should be
Counter
global,
attack from the
and
counter
it should
attack
be
from the east.
appreciated by all people. On the other hand, we are saying we are talking about Swaraj or something like that one. So I shall be very grateful if ma'am please just clarify this thing. We appreciate the work of you can say that the Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam or the Mahatma Gandhi or Swami Vivekananda because their contribution is immense and for the world. In that way, I shall be highly obliged.
Well, Satyendra, let me intervene one point. Counter attack from the east. That was said, observed about Professor Radhakrishnan by Sir Francis Young husband. It
What,
was
sir? What?
Sir Francis Young husband observed about Professor Radhakrishnan that Radhakrishnan represents a counter attack from the east.
No,
It
no,
was
he
Sir-
cited that Vivekananda was the first person who started a counter attack from the east.
I see.
Earlier, that is reverse. You know, sir. Vivekananda continued in a different way. That he said that I have a message to the west, as Buddha has a message to the east.
Yes.
So in that way.
Okay.
But I think, Satyendra, you see, the counterattack from within the same tradition, we had been having this counterattack and again re-counterattack, and so to say. It has been so dynamic a tradition that we don't have to have a counterattack from the East separately, and you don't have to have an accolade from the Westerners. We ourselves, within our own tradition, had the counterattack. The Shishya, I was Shishya of Kalidas Bhattacharya. And you see, I could never accept whatever is said without some scrutiny. And he said once that to have you as my student has been a great fortune. I said it is very big praise for me. I don't deserve it, sir. But no, sir, this is the only way we have been countering our Shishyas countering our gurus, and this is how Indian tradition has been living, so to say. So
Okay.
counter attack from the east, that is, so to say, that has always been so with the Indians, I will say so.
Yes.
Yes, Pooja.
You want me to respond, Satyam, to your other question?
Okay, sir. Okay, madam.
Mr. Chairman, sir, can I respond to his query?
Okay, okay.
Yeah.
I think there is no contradiction. What you see as contradiction between Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam and Swaraj in idea, there is no
Yes.
contradiction.
No contradiction.
Because we have this theory of parts and whole in our philosophy, isn't it? If we are trying to strengthen the parts, that will strengthen the whole. If the parts are left like that, can you imagine a whole being strong? So there is an organismic relationship. Angangi bhava is there. So when we are talking of Swaraj, as I said, pinned each individual, each tiny particle of the universe has to be strong and healthy. Only then everything will be healthy. This body has so many innumerable cells. If even a single cell is infected, the whole body falls down. So there is a relation of parts and whole, and this relation is such a relation that strengthening parts will strengthen the whole. So Vasudha will become a kutumba, but it cannot become a kutumba in void. We have to begin from the tiny, from the anu, and then we can reach the mahat. Right?
Yes.
Hope it's clear.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, yes, Pooja.
Yes, thank you so much, everyone, for this vibrating and proactive session of this program. Thank you all. And now we move further and would like to invite Honorable Chairman, Professor R.C. Sinha, sir, for his presidential speech. Honorable sir.
So first of all, I offer my namaskar to each and everyone on the screen and off the screen. I must congratulate, at the outset, I congratulate Professor Kalyan Kumar Bagchi for throwing light on the concept of Swaraj stipulated in the idea of Swaraj in ideas. The lecture was given to Holy College students
Right.
in 1929, and it was in 30, rightly you have pointed out, in 30, and it was published in Journal of Shanti Niketan and later on by Indian Philosophical Quarterly. So very many students are not aware of this important article. And rightly you have mentioned that the subject as freedom of Acharya is a monumental work. And I can start with the contention relating to the observation of Professor Paneer Selvam regarding originality. Very many critics, not only in India, but outside India, they point out that contemporary Indian thought, they actually they say that after Shankaracharya, no original work has been done by contemporary thinkers. And I several times the one antidote that was relating to a Sanskrit professor in Oxford asked me that is Indian philosophy dead after Shankaracharya? He meant, is Indian philosophy dead after Vedanta? And I tried to reply and certainly the K.C. Bhattacharya is one to whom I consider very original. Such contribution is quite originality. Ordinarily in India, philosophers are those who create systems, build systems, and um, 6 orthodox systems and 3 heterodox systems. Philosophers are only those who created system. But in contemporary in India, the notion, the definition of philosophy requires to be changed, and originality does not lie in creating systems only. Of course, the traditional philosophers, the classical philosophers, they were very original and they created systems. But with the passage of time, originality requires to be, the meaning of originality requires to be reconsidered and rethought. So, in Culture and Value, Wittgenstein says that originality lies in relating one concept to the other. And certainly I do consider that originality lies in interpretation also. Gadamer also says that interpretation is a creative one. So naturally, Professor, I must congratulate and I am thankful to Professor, and simply I say it is wonderful. The whole deliberation is wonderful, in which a professor like Professor Shashi Prabha, she is a very clear, having a classical roots, having a classical understanding. Professor Paneer Selvam, Professor Dave, he is also very much deeply rooted in our tradition, and Professor Asa Mukherjee, because I understand that the chairman has to prepare the background for Thanksgiving ceremony. So before that, I do not want to lose a moment, and I must thank. And there are 1 or 2 points. One point is that in Vedic literature, really rightly, Shashi Prabha pointed out about the Swaraj, self-governance, and in Rig Veda, a very, I can quote very apt. Yate mahi swarajye, swarajye. So self-governance in Vedic literature, when they talk about Swaraj, they talk about Swarajya. But in Mahatma Gandhi, Hind Swaraj, that is Raj, not Rajya. The title of the book, Hind Swaraj. And there is a difference between Hind Swaraj and Swaraj in ideas. Hind Swaraj is basically, he talks about freedom, political freedom, I think. And K.C. Bhattacharya, when he talks about Swaraj in ideas, he talks about the cultural freedom. Actually, the thrust of the K.C. Bhattacharya is that cultural subjection is worse than subjection. वो गुलामी के दिनों की बात है। तो भारत actually in 1930 India was not independent, but the originality and the creativity of K.C. Bhattacharya, that at that time he asserted that cultural subjection is worse than other kind of subjection. We were under colonial rule, but the great thinker and Professor Kalyan Kumar Bagchi is the one and only one man in India at present who has deep association with the entire family of K.C. Bhattacharya, and very deep relationship. And when he speaks about K.C. Bhattacharya, it is a marvelous, wonderful, simply wonderful. And it has been my good luck that in 1973, I had been to Shanti Niketan in the summer course. And Professor Kalyan, I say that I am a student, and he also accepts that he is my teacher. So for 3 months, I lived and naturally, every evening, I used to go to meet the great saint scholar, philosopher, Professor D.M. Dutt, living in Shanti Niketan. So it is my good luck that I might not have read many books, but I had been in association with great philosophers, great thinkers, perchance in BHU when it was a center of advanced study, and regularly seminar. First of all, I heard Professor Kalyan Kumar Bagchi in BHU Center of Advanced Study, and he's so impressive and so energetic. And today also, I was simply elated to hear his voice, the very sound voice. 2 persons at the age of 90.
Thank you.
And one is Professor Ramji Singh ji. Though he is ill, he is sick, but still few days back or few months back, we invited him and he spoke, though he has also attained, I think, contemporary to Professor Kalyan Kumar Bagchi. And luckily, I came to know that though while we have condoled, we have extended condolence to family, to the departed soul of Professor D.P. Chattopadhyay, who has been the founder of this ICPR, and Professor Kalyan Kumar Bagchi had been his class friend. So it is a great honor to ICPR to listen, to invite a man of great understanding and eminence like Professor Kalyan Kumar Bagchi. I really feel greatly honored. And for very many new ideas you have analyzed, and you have made us to think that K.C. Bhattacharya was normally neglected. With due regard, I confess it, that as students, they do not want to read K.C. Bhattacharya, saying that it is very difficult one. But I think if some of the portions, some of the ideas of K.C. Bhattacharya are fantastic, and they should be for instance, the concept of philosophy. The concept of philosophy of K.C. Bhattacharya.
Right, right.
That is a wonderful piece, brilliant piece. Swaraj in ideas. So these things should be, a student should know and study. Because when he says that philosophy is expression of theoretic consciousness, marvelous piece, that the concept of philosophy. So really, I'm thankful, grateful that you have you have enlightened us, and I must thank all those who have raised valuable questions. And Professor Shashi Prabha Kumar is always classical. Whenever she speaks with certain classical roots and modern interpretations. I thank her. And Professor Kalyan Kumar Bagchi especially requested that Shashi Prabha Kumar should be given a special invitation. And naturally, we are thankful. Officially, you can congratulate, we can congratulate her for assuming the charge of a great institution, Indian Institute of Advanced Studies, Shimla. So I happen to be the member of the governing body, so I have congratulated her. But most of my colleagues, on behalf of my colleagues and ICPR, formally I extend the congratulations. Thank you very much. Over to Pooja. Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much for your residential remarks on this great success of this program. And now I would like to invite Dr. Shankar Singh for giving the thanks to all our invited guests. Dr. Shankar Singh.
Shankar.
जी धन्यवाद मैडम जी। आज के इस विशेष व्याख्यान के हमारे मुख्य अतिथि प्रोफेसर कल्याण कुमार बागची जी को मैं परिषद की तरफ से आभार व्यक्त करता हूँ। प्रोफेसर शशि प्रभा कुमार मैडम को जो हमारे परिषद की सम्मानित सदस्य हैं और इस कार्यक्रम के सम्मानित अतिथि हैं, उनको मैडम को मैं धन्यवाद दे रहा हूँ कि इस कार्यक्रम में वो अपने बहुत कम समय में आई और अपने व्याख्यान से उन लोगों को अवगत किया। इस कार्यक्रम में प्रोफेसर पनीर सेल्वम सर, मैं उनको धन्यवाद दे रहा हूँ। प्रोफेसर आशा मुखर्जी जी, प्रोफेसर कृष्णैया जी, प्रोफेसर राजकुमारी सिन्हा मैडम को भी मैं परिषद की तरफ से आभार प्रकट कर रहा हूँ। इस कार्यक्रम में डॉक्टर सरोज कांताकर, प्रोफेसर जनक दवे जी, डॉक्टर प्रोफेसर अनिल कुमार तिवारी जी, डॉक्टर सौरभ मिश्र जी, गौतम मिश्र जी और डॉक्टर सुरेश कुमार, डॉक्टर कमलेश कुमार पासवान, दमयंती गुरुस्ता, प्रोफेसर डॉक्टर आलोक टंडन जी, डॉक्टर सत्येंद्र कुमार श्रीवास्तव जी और डॉक्टर दीपंकर जी, डॉक्टर रोजिता, ये सभी लोग ऑनलाइन के माध्यम से हमारे इस कार्यक्रम में जुड़े थे। इस विशेष व्याख्यान में आप लोग जुड़े थे। आप लोगों को परिषद की तरफ से मैं आभार प्रकट करता हूँ कि आप लोगों ने अपना बहुमूल्य समय निकाल करके आज रविवार के दिन इस कार्यक्रम में जुड़े। और अंत में मैं परिषद के अध्यक्ष प्रोफेसर आर.सी. सिन्हा सर को मैं विशेष रूप से धन्यवाद दे रहा हूँ, जो कि ये इनके मार्गदर्शन में ही ये सब कार्य सफल रहा हो। प्रोफेसर सच्चिदानंद मिश्र जो हमारे सदस्य सचिव हैं, मैं उनको भी धन्यवाद दे रहा हूँ, जो कि हमारे इस विषयों के ही उनकी भी मार्गदर्शन से ये सब कार्य हम लोगों का एकेडमिक जो शैक्षणिक कार्य चल रहा है। डॉक्टर पूजा व्यास जिनके ऊपर बहुत दायित्व इस समय भारतीय दास सिंह अनुसंधान परिषद की है, मैडम को मैं बहुत विशेष और बहुत धन्यवाद दे रहा हूँ कि इस कार्यक्रम में उन्होंने अपने जो उसको संपूर्ण किया। और लखनऊ के जो टीम भी काम कर रही है इस कार्यक्रम में, आज रविवार के दिन संडे के दिन ऑफिस को खोल के लोगों ने इस कार्यक्रम को चला रहे हैं। ये कार्यक्रम हमारा यूट्यूब चैनल पर भी है। अगर इसको दोबारा इस लेक्चर व्याख्यान को सुनना होगा तो यूट्यूब चैनल की लिंक मैं सभी लोगों को प्रोवाइड कर दूंगा, और आप लोग सभी लोग इसको फिर दोबारा भी सुन सकते हैं। अंत में मैं इस कार्यक्रम से जुड़े सभी लोगों को एक बार पुनः परिषद की तरफ से आभार करता हूँ, नमस्कार करता हूँ।
जी, राजकुमारी जी को भी नमस्ते और साहब को नमस्ते। आशा मुखर्जी, प्रोफेसर आशा मुखर्जी, after a long gap you have appeared.
Thank you so much. Yeah, it has been such a pleasure. How can I afford not to listen to Kalanda and also to Professor Chikovata? This is one of the rarest opportunities we have to listen to Kalanda. Yeah, dear and respected Kalanda.
Thanks to you also.